Okay, we're on the bottom of Chav Ches Amud Beis because we had a short DAF yesterday because of Rosh Chodesh. But we're 7 lines from the bottom on Chav Ches Amud Beis, and the Gemara's question is Minahani Mili. Where do we know this from? Where do we know what? Where do we know what the Mishnah had just told us, that there is a mitzvah that during the 7 days of Sukkot you're supposed to live in your sukkah like that's your permanent residence, and therefore the Mishnah had said, make your sukkah during Sukkot your diras keva, your permanent residence, and your home, your regular home, which is normally your permanent residence, make that your non-permanent residence. Okay? So, Minahani Mili, where do we know this from? Detanu Rabbanon Teishvu Ke'ein Taduru. As it says in the Torah, Basukos Teishvu Shivas Yamim. Live in the sukkah for 7 days. And live means live in it like the way you would normally reside. Mikan Amru, Kol Shivas Hayamim Osa Adam Sukkaso Keva Ubeisa Aryai. From here the rabbis learned that a person during the 7 days of Sukkot should make his sukkah, his regular residence, his home, and his regular house, that should become his temporary residence, his non-permanent residence. So let's illustrate this. Hayulo Kalim Noim Ma'alan L'Sukkah. Matzos Nos Ma'alan L'Sukkah. That if you have nice utensils, then you should bring them up to your sukkah. Remember, the reason why we use the word up is because it was typical for people to build their sukkah on their rooftops. Or if you have nice furniture, nice cushions, bring them up to your sukkah. Ochel v'shosa u'metayel b'sukkah u'mishanein b'sukkah. You should eat, drink, relax in the sukkah, and also you should be mishanein, from the word vishinantam levanecha. You should study, engross yourself in study inside the sukkah. So the Gemara's question is, Eini, is this really so that you should engross yourself in study in the sukkah? The ha'amar Rava mikra umisna b'metalalta utunuye bar b'metalalta. Rava had taught us that studying Chumash and studying Mishnah is appropriate for the sukkah. But studying in detail Talmudic study, which what we would call Talmudic study, in-depth engrossment in study, that should be done outside of the sukkah.
Good morning.
Why? So like Rashi and Tosfos both explain, because you need a sense of openness, you need open space when you're studying, especially when you're engrossed in really very in-depth mental exercise. You want to be able to have harchava, you want to be able to have an open environment, open air, fresh air. You know, some yeshivas are very cramped, but that's not, like from this Gemara you see that that's not the best way to study. You got to study with a sense of harchava sadas. You got to go outside, take a breath of fresh air. And sometimes the sukkah is not conducive to that kind of concentrated study. So how can you tell me that you're supposed to be mishanein in the sukkah, which is engrossed study? Lokasha ha-b'migras ha-b'iyunei. The Gemara says really there are 2 types of Talmudic study. One is just to review that which you've already learned, like this is Asr and this is Mutter, Rabbi so-and-so says X, Rabbi so-and-so says Y, right? Just go over the material. That does not require a high degree of mental concentration, which would necessitate getting fresh air. And the other kind of study, which is supposed to be, which is more productive when it's outside the sukkah, is a type of study which requires analysis, analytical thought. And that's something that should be done outside the sukkah, or can be done outside the sukkah, if a person can't muster the concentration inside. Kiha, the Rav of Rami Bar Chama, ki havukaimi mikamei de Rav Chisda. These 2 sages, when they would stand in front of Rav Chisda to listen to his shir, mirahati begemara bahadi hadadi, v'hadar ma'ayini bisvara. So the 2 of them, first, immediately they would sit in chavrusa, immediately after shir, and they would do what we call in yeshiva chazaras ashir. What is chazaras ashir? You just go over and repeat, oh, Rav Chisda had gesagt azoi. He said this, and then he said this, and then he said this point. That's the first part of the chavrusa study. But then the next part of the chavrusa studies is, now what we got, the shir klor, now let's think about certain points that we may have problems with. And then you go into deeper analysis, which requires a greater level of concentration. So you see that there are 2 types of Talmudic study. One is like going over the DAF. The learning DAF Yomi you can do in the sukkah. But when you want to learn Tosfos and, some of the Brisker Torah and the Ketsos Achosh and the Avnei Miluim, so then you got to go outside the sukkah. That's what the Gemara is really trying to tell us. So the Gemara now says, Amar Rava, Mani mishtaya b'metalalta, mani meichla bar mimetalalta. Now that we've talked about certain things that are done in the sukkah and certain things that are more appropriate outside the sukkah, in a related topic, the Gemara is now telling us things that are allowed to remain in the sukkah and things that should be taken out of the sukkah, because if you keep them in the sukkah, it's considered to be a desecration of the sukkah and ruins the ambiance. So drinking cups that are left over from, when you're drinking wine, you can leave that in the sukkah. That's not that's not gross if you leave that over, that's fine. But if you have dirty dishes, you have dirty pots from the meal, you shouldn't leave that in the sukkah. That has to be removed immediately after the meal, because otherwise it makes the sukkah not nice to live in, and therefore you want to get it out of there. Chatzva v'shachil bar mimetalalta, but ushraga b'metalalta. And in the same vein, certain kinds of containers, which are either made out of earthenware or wooden buckets, and those are used to draw water. So the Gemara says those should be kept outside the sukkah. You don't want to keep buckets of water in the sukkah. That ruins the ambiance. But a lantern, to keep the place illuminated, even though it's made out of earthenware and sometimes it gets a little dirty, but that you can keep in the sukkah. V'amri la bar mimitalata, some say that should also be outside the sukkah, v'lo pligi, but there's no machlokes, habasuka gedola, habasuka ketana. The difference is that when you're in a small sukkah, that's just 7 by 7 tvachim, if you put in a lantern, that precludes some of the living space. It takes away some of the available space, and you no longer have 7 by 7 to keep yourself and your table in the sukkah. So that's when you have to keep the lantern out. But if you have a larger sukkah, then keep the lantern inside. That's perfectly fine. The next thing that we learned in the Mishnah is if it rains, that's a siman klala. If it rains in the sukkah, that's not a good sign. And the question is, at what point or what level of rainfall are you now exempt? Because you're a mitzvah, or you can't stick in there anymore. So the Mishnah had said, until your mikveh, until your viscous porridge is starting to get ruined. And we said that a mikveh it's not liquid, it's not like soup, but it's not a solid food, it's like in between. It's like a stew or a porridge, okay? So that, when that starts to get ruined by the raindrops, then you know it's time to go inside. So Tana Mishatisrach HaMikveh Shel Gris in the Brisa just clarifies further that we're talking about a bean porridge, which it more easily spoils if too much water gets in. Abaya v'kayosif kamei Rav Yosef b'metalalta. So now the Gemara tells us that a story, Abaya the student was once sitting in front of his Rebbe Rav Yosef in the sukkah. Noshav zika v'kamaisi tzivosa. The wind blew, and because it was a strong gust, bless you, it blew some of the some of the crustaceans from the schach, some of the whatever, the splinters, whatever it was. It could have been pine needles. It could have been something that was crusty on the schach fell off, like the bark or whatever it was, fell into the sukkah. So Amar lahu Rav Yosef panuli mani mehacha. So Rav Yosef says, I'm out of here. Get all my stuff out of the sukkah. Amar le Abaya v'hatnan mishatisra chamikva. So Abaya says, Rebbe, come on, this doesn't rise to the level of the stew or the porridge getting spoiled. It's just a little bit of bark that fell down. So Amar le lididi kiven danina daitoy kemishatisra chamikva dami li. So he said, listen, as far as I'm concerned, it's from my perspective, this is just as bad because I'm a fastidious person. What you see from this Gemara is something very important, and that it is subjective to the person himself, right? If you're a fastidious person and you can't stand it inside the sukkah, so then you're putter. So what's interesting is that Rav Yosef, like Rashi documents, had once said about himself that I'm one of the most fastidious people and I have no life, because the Gemara says that there are three qualities within a person that if you have these qualities, your life is no life. One is a Rachmanus. If you're overly compassionate, then every time you see a homeless person, you won't be able to sleep at night, right? So, and then as Raschanus, if you have a fiery temper that something gets your goat, you get all excited, right? That's also a bad quality to have. And the third quality is Aninus Adas, is fastidiousness, because you're so finicky that everything, everything is just a little bit out of place and it disturbs you. So Rav Yosef said, I have all three qualities. He basically realized that he wasn't a happy camper. Anyway, Tanu Rabbanan. Haya ochel besukkah v'yardu geshamim v'yarad ein matrichenos olalos ad sheyigmor sudas. So the Brisa tells us that if you're eating in the sukkah, all of a sudden it starts raining torrentially, so you got to get out of the sukkah. So you move everything out, you bring it into your house, you start eating your meal, and then all of a sudden it stops raining, so you can go back. We don't require you to stop mid-mouthful and put everything back in the sukkah. You're allowed to wait until you finish your meal. Yeah, there's a reasonableness to this halacha. You can wait, finish your meal, eat like a mensch, and then go back into the sukkah. And furthermore, if let's say you were sleeping in the sukkah, all of a sudden you get woken up at 2 a.m, it's all wet, and you got to go back in the house. So then it stops raining. So since you've already gone to bed in the house, you don't have to go back in the sukkah until it's ye'or. Now, literally, ye'or means until it's light. So, but the Gemara says, "Yiboyilhu ad sheye'or o ad sheye'or." Is it ye'or with an ayin, which means until you wake up, or is it ye'or with an aleph, which means until it's light in the morning? So tashma ad sheye'or v'yale amud hashachar. So the Brisa says until it's ye'or and dawn arrives. So the Gemara says, "Tarte?" question mark, exclamation point. What do you mean? What do you mean? How can you tell me first it's got to get light and then dawn arrives? That doesn't make any sense. At first dawn arrives and then it gets light. And why would you have to say the same thing? If they mean the same thing, then it's a redundancy. So the Gemara says, "Ela ema ad sheye'or," with an ayin, until you wake up, and v'yale amud hashachar, and dawn arrives. So it turns out the way Rashi learns is that you need 2 criteria in order to be obligated to go back in the sukkah after you came inside after a rain. Number 1, you wake up on your own. In other words, no one's obligated to wake you up or for you to set your alarm clock. You can wake up naturally if you're already inside the house. Number 2, if you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're also not obligated to go back in the sukkah. You can read the paper in bed because you only have to wait until dawn arrives before you have to go back inside, up into the sukkah. So 2 criteria: wake up on your own and let it be light outside. Those are the 2 things. So the Mishnah had then said, you know what this is analogous to when it rains in the sukkah? It's like a servant trying to serve his master a cup of wine, and he pours the decanter all over him. So the Gemara says, who's pouring on whom? Now the question is really interesting. The Gemara acknowledges, we understand what's going on here. We understand that the Mishnah is trying to give us a metaphor for Hashem showing that he's angry with us. But the question is, when we talk about the pouring of the decanter, is it that the servant instigates it by doing something very rude and wretched, that he pours the decanter all over his master and gets his master angry? Is that what you're trying to say, that Hashem we got Hashem angry and that's why he's kicking us out of the sukkah? Or is the analogy that Hashem is pouring the decanter upon us, and that's really what the rain represents? He says, basically, I want you out of the sukkah. But they both sides of the question really acknowledge that the Mishnah's metaphor is a metaphor for that Hashem doesn't want us in the sukkah. So Tashma, Detanya Shafach lo Rabo Kiton Alpana v'Amar lo Yevshi b'Shimu Sheikh. That really the Brisa clarifies it's analogous to the master pouring the decanter upon his servant and saying, I don't want your service anymore. That's really what it's telling us. Tana Rabbanan. Now that we're talking about simanim of klala, that rainfall in the sukkah is a siman of curse, let's talk about other things that are a siman from heaven, that Hashem is not happy. Tana Rabbanan, Bisman shehacham aloka siman ra l'chol ha'olam kula. That when the sun is afflicted, this is a bad sign to the world. What are we talking about? It seems that we're talking about a solar eclipse. That's really what that's really what the implication is over here. When is the sun afflicted? The sun is never afflicted. It seems like there's some kind of astronomical phenomenon such that the sun is darkened in the sky. And that's usually an eclipse, unless you could argue that there are other phenomena, like maybe a meteorite shower that darkens the sun temporarily. But all of these things are a siman from heaven that God is not happy. And why is that? And by the way, this is not just a Jewish concept. This was ubiquitous. The idea, you see, old motion pictures that depict this as well. What was that famous, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court? That was a famous short story. I forget who was it. Mark Twain, I think. Mark Twain wrote that. So what was one of the things in the book, in the story? that he says, I'm going to bring a plague to the world, because he knew from his almanac when there would be an eclipse. Because he came from the future, right? And he said, okay, the gods are angry with you, right? And so they all got scared of him and they ran away. So this is a siman ra la'olam. This is something that the world was recognized that this is a bad omen when the sun goes dark.
Rabbi, the solar eclipse is known as Likui.
Yeah.
Where?
In Yiddish.
In Yiddish, really? Oh, okay.
Which means?
An affliction of the sun. An affliction of the sun.
Which is Lashon Kodesh, really.
Right, it's really Lashon Kodesh, yeah.
Same.
Mashal amahadover daimis. So what is this analogous to? Lamelech baser v'dam shas asuda la'avodav v'hiniach panas lifneim. Ka'as aleim v'amar la'avdo tul panas mipneihem v'hoshiveim b'choshech. It's analogous to a king who wanted to serve his guests at a night meal, and so he puts a lantern in front of them to illuminate the table. When he gets upset with them, he tells the servant, take away the lantern. So that's the idea of a solar eclipse. God is saying, I'm taking away the sun because I don't want you to benefit from my world anymore. Tanya, Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol Zman Shema Oros Lokin Siman Ralas Oneim Shel Yisrael, Bipnei Shemelumadim B'Makoseihem. This is a very important, a very profound statement that Rabbi Meir says when the celestial bodies are afflicted, or you can see some kind of transition or darkening of them, this is a bad sign to the Jewish people. Why? Because the Jewish people really are the center of humanity. We are the ones who suffer the most. We're used to persecution. So if God is going to send an omen of persecution to the world, the message is primarily directed at the Jewish people. And it's not just the celestial bodies. It's if there's a tsunami, if there's any natural act of God in the world, the primary message is to the Jewish people. Why? Because we know what it means to suffer. We're used to suffering. And the way that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi describes it is that we suffer for the entire world. It's an amazing concept. Mashal asofer shabola beis hasefer ritzua biyado. Mi doeg, mi shraga lilkos b'chol yom vayom hu doeg. The analogy is that if the teacher comes to school one day with a whipping strap in his hand, the person who tziters the most is the kid who's used to being whipped the most. He says, teacher's in a bad mood today. I better behave myself. Right? So that you understand, since the Jewish people are used to persecution, we recognize that the message is primarily for us.
Wouldn't it be clearer if the tsunami happened in Israel than in Asia? I mean, if the message is...
Not necessarily, because as long as the message is given so that it's to the entire world, right? Even though there may be specific individuals who suffer more, but the fact that the world is made aware of it, that's a message. That's a message. I mean, you could say that when media was more localized, then perhaps you could argue that, but I would say that in today's world, when there was an earthquake in Portugal in the 18th century that shattered the Christian church, it was anyway, there's more to discuss. We don't have time. Tanu Rabbanan. Bizman shehacham aloka siman rala ovdei kochavim levana aloka siman rala sanim shel Yisrael. Now this brisa slightly disagrees with the previous brisa. This brisa says it depends. When the sun is eclipsed, then that's a bad sign to the idolaters of the world, to the non-Jews. When the moon is eclipsed, when there's a lunar eclipse, only that is a bad sign to the Jewish people. Because the Jews use the moon as their chronometer, and the other nations use the sun as their criterion. Now, for their calendar. Now, Loka b'mizrach siman ra liyoshvei mizrach, b'marav siman ra liyoshvei marav. This is sort of like what Rabbi Sudley was suggesting. If the sun or whatever celestial body is eclipsed in the eastern sky, then this is a bad sign to the people who live in the east. If it is eclipsed in the western sky, then that's a bad sign for the people who live in the west. But if it's in the middle of the sky, then it's a bad sign for the entire world. If the sun is eclipsed so that it looks ruddy, if it looks red, that's a sign of blood, and it means that bloodshed through the sword, through violence, is going to come to the world through some kind of war. But if the sun turns an ashen color, so then that's like a sackcloth, then that's a sign that famine is going to come to the world, because when there's a famine, people's faces turn an ashen, dark color. Lazu v'lazu, cherev v'chitzei ro'ev boin la'olam. If, God forbid, it has both features, it's both red and ashen in appearance, then that's a sign that both bloodshed and famine will come to the world. Laka b'chinisaso puranos shohel lavo, b'yitziaso mimaheres lavo. If the sun is afflicted, or it is eclipsed as it's just setting, then that's a sign that it's going to take a long time. It's not going to come immediately, the suffering to the world. And the reason is because just like the sun sets at the end of the day, after a long day, so too the siman is that after a long period of waiting, eventually suffering will come. But if the sun is eclipsed as it's just rising, only a short interval into the day, then that's a sign that the world will be afflicted very shortly. Some say just the opposite. When the sun is setting, there's only a short amount of day left, and then there's going to be night, so that's a sign that the affliction is going to come very rapidly. And when the sun is just rising, then that's a sign that there's a lot of daytime left before the night comes, and therefore there's going to be an interval, a long lag between the eclipse and the suffering. And furthermore, the Brisa says that any time a nation is afflicted, invariably it's God, which means, Rashi, it's Sar, it's angel, it's guardian angel. Every nation has its own guardian angel, except for the Jewish nation, which only has God without any intermediaries, right? But any guardian angel of the other nations will be afflicted together with the nation. Shenemar uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shefatim. That by the plagues it says that I will bring wonders not only upon Egypt, but upon the gods of Egypt as well. And finally, the Brisa says, when the Jewish people are fulfilling God's will, they don't even have to fear from any kind of negative omens. They don't have to fear from eclipses. They don't have to fear from any of these kinds of things, because Shenemar Koamar Hashem, that so says Hashem in Sefer Yirmiyah, El derech hagoyim al tilmadu, ume'osos hashamayim al techtu, ki yechtu hagoyim mehema. So God says, don't learn from the ways of the non-Jews, and don't be scared from omens in the heaven. Only the other nations have to fear that. Only the other nations, says God, have to fear these omens, but the Jewish people don't have to fear. But that's only true, says the Gemara, when the Jewish people are behaving like Jews and doing the will of Hashem. Tanu Rabbanan. So the Brisa now says, Bishvil arba'a devarim chamaloke. There are 4 reasons why the sun is afflicted. Now Rashi openly states that he doesn't see the association between these 4 things and a solar eclipse. For 4 things there's a solar eclipse. So what are these 4 things? Al-av based in shemes ve'eno nisbad ka'alacha. If a great rabbinic leader dies and he's not properly mourned or eulogized. Ve'al nara ha'ma'orasa shetzaka be'ir ve'en moshiala. If a Jewish girl who's betrothed is raped in the city and no one is there to try and help her, to save her, that's also tremendous tragedy and tremendous injustice. Ve'al mishkav zachar, for homosexuality. Ve'al shnei achin shenishbach damin ke'echad. And if 2 brothers are killed on the same day, again, a tragedy, a pathetic tragedy. These are things that cause Hashem to be gravely disappointed in humanity, and that brings a solar eclipse. Uvishvil arba dvarim ma'oros lokin. There are 4 reasons why other constellations are eclipsed. Al kosve plastar, if people write forged documents, meaning like, I forge your signature so that I can get you to take you to court. Ve'al me'idei edu sheker, false witnesses. Ve'al megadli behemadaka be'eretz Yisrael, people who raise small animals in Israel, causing the foliage and vegetation of Israel to be depleted. And also, these animals will graze on others' properties and they'll invariably steal other people's vegetation. The alkotzetsei ilanos tovos, and for people who chop down and wantonly destroy the ecosystem, right? So these are things that cause God also to be profoundly disappointed in humanity, and he brings an eclipse on other constellations, right? So by the way, this is a very ecological Gemara. You see that Hashem says, well, if you're wantonly destroying good trees, there's no excuse for that. Tell that to the people in Alberta. Uvishvil daled devarim nichsei balabatim nimsarim lemalchos. And there are four reasons why a person's assets will be taken by the tax man. That's a good thing to keep in mind as April rolls around. There are four things that cause your money to be confiscated by the government. Almashe shtaros pruim, if you hold on to promissory notes that have already been paid in the hopes of illicitly using them a second time. Ve'almalve beribis, or if you lend money with interest, a fellow Jew. Ve'al shahaya safek biyadam limchos v'lo michu, or if you have the ability, like we learned before about the Nara HaMe'orasa, if you have the ability to prevent injustice and you just stand by idly, right? And finally, Va'al shaposkim tzedakah barabim ve'enon nostim, or if a person makes a public pledge to give tzedakah and he doesn't fulfill his pledge. You can speak to Moshe, he knows plenty about that in the business of tzedakah collections. Amar Rav bishvil arba dvarim nichsei balabatim yotzim letimyon. There are four reasons why the assets of people of means just are lost. You know, the market crashes and you lose everything. How does that happen? Al kovshei schar sachir, if you don't pay your employee on time. Ve'al oshkei schar sachir, if you just blow off an employee and just don't pay him at all. Ve'al sheporkin, or you just basically change the rules in midstream. Ve'al sheporkin ol me'al tzavarein v'nosen l'chavarein, or if a person shirks his communal or financial responsibilities and just says, let someone else take care of it. Ve'al gasus haruach, and for arrogance. Ve'gasus haruach keneged kulam, and the worst of those four is arrogance. Aval ba'anavim ksiv, whereas by the humble it says, Va'anavim yirshu aretz v'his'anagu al rov shalom, that the meek shall inherit the earth. You know that famous phrase, the humble shall inherit the earth, and they shall have pleasure with an abundance of peace. Hadron alach hayashen. So now, if you have your art scroll Gemaras and you want to switch, this is the time. I think you go to volume 2, right? Or is it right?
Volume 2.
Yeah.
If you brought it with you.
If you brought it with you. But we're going to go weiter, and we won't go too much into the next DAF, so don't worry. Just remember to bring your volume 2 tomorrow. Lulav hagazul v'hayavesh pasul. So now we're switching gears entirely, and we're moving from SUKKAH to the Arba Minim, to the other mitzvah of Sukkot, which is shaking lulav. So lulav and esrog. So the Mishnah tells us that if it's a stolen lulav, or if it's a dried out lulav, that's not usable. A stolen lulav, we'll see why, because basically it says, the Torah says you have to take something that belongs to you to fulfill the mitzvah, and this is not yours. If it's dried out, it's possible, because as we'll learn, it has to be a vegetation that is attractive. If it's not attractive, if it's ugly, so then it's not kosher. We'll learn about that more later on. Shalashera v'shalira nidachas pasul. If it's idolatry vegetation, if it's used for idolatry, or if it's from an ir nidachas, which is a city where God says that it was idolatrous and therefore you have to destroy all its contents, these are things which the Torah says you have to destroy them. So by virtue of the fact that I have to destroy them, if I take them, it's as if they're non-existent even presently, and therefore you can't fulfill a mitzvah with something which halachically has the status of being non-existent. Niktam rosho nifritzu alav pasul. If the tip of the lulav is clipped off, or if its leaves are completely fanned out like a broom, Rashi says, so then that's not kosher. Once again, it has lost its attractiveness. But nifredu alav kosher, if the leaves are not completely fanned out, but only partially fanned out, so that they're still attached primarily they're attached, but they're just branching out a little bit, so then it's still kosher. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yogedenu Milamala. And Rabbi Yehuda just says that in such a case, in order for it to still be considered kosher, you should tie it up to bind the leaves at the top together. Tzine har habarzel kisheros, a certain kind of lulav that comes from an iron mountain. That's really what literally it translates as. These are considered to be like it's considered a rough terrain. So the leaves and the palm fronds are not as attractive, but nevertheless it's attractive enough to be considered kosher. And lulav sheyesh bo shlosha tfachim kedei lananeo bo kasher. And if a lulav has 3 tfachim to be able to shake, it's still kosher. Now, what that means exactly is something the Gemara will have to clarify. It doesn't mean that it can be a lulav that's 3 tfachim high. It means that it has to be above the area of the hadassim. It has to be 3 tfachim, so that the area that shakes above the other minim is 3 tfachim. Okay, let's go on to the Gemara. Kapasik v'tani loshna b'yom tov rishon v'loshna b'yom tov sheni. So the Gemara says, it seems from the language of the Mishnah that all of these things that are puzzle, there's no distinction whether it's the first day or the other 6 days of Sukkot, right? Okay, fine. So Bishlama Yavesh Hadar Ba'inan Veleka. I can understand if it's a dried out lulav, why that's puzzle all 7 days, because the Torah says, Ulakachtem lachem bayom harishon pri eitz hadar. It has to be the fruit of a beautiful tree. It has to be attractive, and if it's not attractive, you can't fulfill the mitzvah with it. However, elagazel bishlam yom tov rishon dichsiv lachem mishalachem elabiyom tov sheni amai lo. But as far as it being stolen, that it's not a valid for the mitzvah, I can understand the first day. The Torah says, take for yourself on the first day. So we'll learn later on in more detail that the Torah requires that dafka on the first day, the lulav has to be your property. You can't borrow someone else's lulav on the first day to fulfill the mitzvah. And that would make sense why, if it's stolen on the first day, it's not your property, so then it's not kosher for the mitzvah. But what about the other 6 days? You can borrow someone else's lulav and fulfill the mitzvah just by shaking it. So why can't you use a stolen lulav as well and fulfill the mitzvah? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Mishum Dahavale Mitzvah Haba Ba'avera. So you have that famous principle of it's a mitzvah that is only performed through the performance of a sin. And the only way that you're doing the mitzvah is by stealing, right? Like the Robin Hood syndrome, right? If you steal from the rich to give to the poor, that's a mitzvah ba'avera. That's a mitzvah that comes through doing an avera, and that's not a mitzvah at all. You can't really do a mitzvah that way. Shenemar v'havesem gazul ve'es hapiseach ve'es hachoyle. The Navi in Malachi castigates the people for bringing stolen property or stolen animals and animals that are handicapped and sickly as sacrifices. So the pasuk seems to be comparing gazul dumyut piseach. A stolen animal is just like a handicapped animal. Ma piseach lesle takanta af gazul lesle takanta. Just like a handicapped animal is physically disabled and cannot be repaired, so too something that's stolen cannot be repaired. Once it's stolen, it's you can't do a mitzvah with it anymore. And the Gemara says, Lo shna lifnei yeyush v'lo shna la'achar yeyush. And it makes no difference, even if the owner that you stole it from gives up on this object, it's still, since you acquired it through ill-gotten gains, it was stolen, that is permanently tainted, and you can never do a mitzvah with it ever again. And we'll elaborate on this discussion, Mirz Hashem, tomorrow.